From the macabre minds of Laughing Devil Production comes another story from the Nightshade Diary. You know what that means. Check under the bed and make sure no one or nothing is there. Is the closet door securely shut? Then leave your disbelief behind, amp up your imagination, and hang on tight for another ride into terror and mystery. And like all good horror stories, just imagine it's a dark and stormy night. And remember, screaming like a little girl is permitted. Canavan's Backyard by Joseph Payne, Brennan. I first met Canavan over 20 years ago, shortly after he had immigrated from London. He was an antiquarian and a lover of old books, and so he quite naturally set up shop as a second-hand book dealer after he settled in New Haven. Since his small capital didn't permit him to rent premises in the center of the city, he engaged combined business and living quarters in an isolated old house near the outskirts of town. The section was sparsely settled, but since a good percentage of Canavan's business was transacted by mail, it didn't particularly matter. Quite often, after a morning spent at my typewriter, I walked out to Canavan's shop and spent most of the afternoon browsing among his old books. I found it a great pleasure, especially because Canavan never resorted to high-pressure methods to make a sale. He was aware of my precarious financial situation. He never frowned if I walked away empty-handed. In fact, he seemed to welcome me for my company alone. Only a few book buyers called at his place with regularity, and I think he was often lonely. Sometimes when business was slow, he would brew a pot of English tea, and the two of us would sit for hours drinking tea and talking about books. Canavan even looked like an antiquarian book dealer, or the popular caricature of one. He was small of frame, somewhat stoop-shouldered, and his blue eyes peered out from behind archaic spectacles with steel rims and quarter-cut lenses. Although I doubt if his yearly income ever matched that of a good paper-hanger, he managed to get by, and he was content. Content, that is, until he began noticing his backyard. Behind the ramshackle old house in which he lived and ran his shop stretched a long, desolate yard overgrown with brambles and high, brindle-colored grass. Several decayed apple trees, jagged and black with rot, added to the scene's dismal aspect. The broken wooden fences on both sides of the yard were all but swallowed up by the tangle of coarse grass. They appeared to be literally sinking into the ground. Altogether, the yard presented an unusually depressing picture, and I often wondered why Canavan didn't clean it up. But it was none of my business. I never mentioned it. One afternoon, when I visited the shop, Canavan was not in the front display room, and I therefore walked down a narrow corridor to a rear storeroom where he sometimes worked, packing and unpacking book shipments. When I entered the storeroom, Canavan was standing at the window looking out at the backyard. I started to speak and then for some reason didn't. I think what stopped me was the look on Canavan's face. He was gazing out at the yard with a peculiar, intense expression, as if he were completely absorbed by something he saw there. Varying, conflicting emotions showed on his strained features. He seemed both fascinated and fearful, attracted and repelled. When he finally noticed me, he almost jumped. He stared at me for a moment as if I were a total stranger. Then his old easy smile came back, and his blue eyes twinkled behind the square spectacles. He shook his head. "That backyard of mine sure looks funny sometimes. You look at it long enough, you think it runs for miles." That was all he said at the time, and I soon forgot about it. But had I only known, that was just the beginning of the horrible business. After that, whenever I visited the shop, I found Canavan in the rear storeroom. Once in a while he was actually working, but most of the time he was simply standing at the window, looking out at the dreary yard of his. Sometimes he would stand there for minutes, completely oblivious to my presence. Whatever he saw appeared to rivet his entire attention. His countenance at these times showed an expression of fright mingled with a queer kind of pleasurable expectancy. Usually it was necessary for me to cough loudly or shuffle my feet before he turned from the window. Afterward, when he talked about books, he would seem to be his old self again, but I began to experience the disconcerting feeling that he was merely acting, that while he chatted about incunabula, his thoughts were actually still dwelling on that infernal backyard. Several times I thought of questioning him about the yard, but whenever words were on the tip of my tongue, I was stopped by a sense of embarrassment. How can one admonish a man for looking out of a window at his own backyard? What does one say, and how does one say it? I kept silent. Later, I regretted it bitterly. Canavan's business, never really flourishing, began to diminish. Worse than that, he appeared to be failing physically. He grew more stooped and gaunt, and though his eyes never lost their sharp glint, I began to believe it was more the glitter of fever than the twinkle of healthy enthusiasm which animated them. One afternoon, when I entered the shop, Canavan was nowhere to be found. Thinking he might just be outside the back door engaged in some household chore, I leaned up against the rear window and looked out. I didn't see Canavan, but as I gazed out over the yard, I was swept with a sudden inexplicable sense of desolation, which seemed to roll over me like the wave of an icy sea. My initial impulse was to pull away from the window, but something held me. As I stared out over that miserable tangle of briars and brindle grass, I experienced what, for want of a better word, I can only call curiosity. Perhaps some cool, analytical, dispassionate part of my brain simply wanted to discover what had caused my sudden sense of acute depression, or possibly some feature of that wretched vista attracted me on a subconscious level which I had never permitted to crowd up into my sane and waking hours. In any case, I remained at the window. The long, dry brown grass wavered slightly in the wind. The rotted black trees reared motionless. Not a single bird, not even a butterfly, hovered over that bleak expanse. There was nothing to be seen except the stalks of long brindle grass, the decayed trees, and scattered clumps of low growling briary bushes. Yet there was something about that particular isolated slice of landscape which I found intriguing. I think I had the feeling that it presented some kind of puzzle, and that if I gazed at it long enough, the puzzle would resolve itself. After I had stood looking out at it for a few minutes, I experienced the odd sensation that its perspectives were subtly altering. Neither the grass nor the trees changed, and yet the yard itself seemed to expand its dimensions. At first I merely reflected that the yard was actually much longer than I had previously believed. Then I had an idea that in reality it stretched for several acres. Finally I became convinced that it continued for an interminable distance, and that if I entered it, I might walk for miles and miles before I came to the end. I was seized by a sudden, almost overpowering desire to rush out the back door, plunge into that sea of wavering brindle grass, and stride straight ahead until I had discovered for myself just how far it did extend. I was in fact on the point of doing so when I saw Canavan. He appeared abruptly out of the tangle of tall grass at the rear end of the yard. For at least a minute he seemed to be completely lost. He looked at the back of his own house as if he had never in his life seen it before. He was disheveled and obviously excited. Briars clung to his trousers, and jackets and pieces of grass were stuck in the hooks of his old-fashioned shoes. His eyes roved around wildly. He seemed about to turn and bolt back into the tangle from which he had just emerged. I rapped loudly on the window pane. He paused in a half-turn, looked over his shoulder, and saw me. Gradually, an expression of normalcy returned to his agitated features. Walking in a weary slouch, he approached the house. I hurried to the door and let him in. He went straight to the front display room and sank down in a chair. He looked up when I followed him into the room. "Frank," he said in a whisper, "would you make some tea?" I brewed tea and he drank it, scalding hot, without saying a word. He looked utterly exhausted. I knew he was too tired to tell me what had happened. "You had better stay indoors for a few days," I said as I left. He nodded weakly without looking up and bade me good day. When I returned to the shop the next afternoon, he appeared rested and refreshed, but nevertheless moody and depressed. He made no mention of the previous day's episode. For a week or so it seemed as if he might forget about the yard. But one day when I went into the shop, he was standing at the rear window, and I could see that he tore himself away only with the greatest reluctance. After that the pattern began repeating itself with regularity, and I knew that that weird tangle of brindle grass behind the house was becoming an obsession. Because I feared for his business as well as for his fragile health, I finally remonstrated with him. I pointed out that he was losing customers. He had not issued a book catalog in months. I told him that the time spent in gazing at that witch's half-acre he called his backyard would be better spent in listing his books and filling his orders. I assured him that an obsession such as his was sure to undermine his health. And finally I pointed out the absurd and ridiculous aspects of the affair. If people knew he spent hours in staring out his window at nothing more than a miniature jungle of grass and briars, they might think he was actually mad. I ended by boldly asking him exactly what he had experienced that afternoon when I had seen him come out of the grass with a lost, bewildered expression on his face. He removed his square spectacles with a sigh. "Frank," he said, "I know you mean well, but there's something about that backyard, some secret that I've got to find out. I don't know what it is exactly. Something about distance and dimensions and perspectives, I think. But whatever it is, I've come to consider it, well, a challenge. I've got to get to the root of it. If you think I'm crazy, I'm sorry, but I'll have no rest until I solve the riddle of that piece of ground." He replaced his spectacles with a frown. "That afternoon," he went on, "when you were standing at the window, I had a strange and frightening experience out there. I had been watching at the window, and finally I felt myself drawn irresistibly outside. I plunged into the grass with a feeling of exhilaration, of adventure, of expectancy. As I advanced into the yard, my sense of elation quickly changed to a mood of black depression. I turned around, intending to come right out, but I couldn't. You won't believe this, I know, but I was lost. I simply lost all sense of direction and couldn't decide which way to turn. That grass is taller than it looks. When you get into it, you can't see anything beyond it. I know this sounds incredible, but I wandered out there for an hour. The yard seemed fantastically large once I got into that tangle of grass. It almost seemed to alter its dimensions as I moved, so that a large expanse of it lay always in front of me. I must have walked in circles. I swear I trudged miles." He shook his head. "You don't have to believe me. I don't expect you to. But that's what happened. When I finally found my way out, it was by the sheerest accident. And the strangest part of it is that once I got out, I felt suddenly terrified without the tall grass all around me, and I wanted to rush back in again. This in spite of the ghastly sense of desolation which the place aroused in me. But I've got to go back. I've got to figure the thing out. There's something out there that defies the laws of earthly nature as we know them. I mean to find out what it is. I think I have a plan, and I mean to put it into practice." His words stirred me strangely, and when I uneasily recalled my own experience at the window that afternoon, I found it difficult to dismiss his story as sheer nonsense. I did half-heartedly try to dissuade him from entering the yard again, but I knew even as I spoke that I was wasting my breath. I left the shop that afternoon with a feeling of oppression and foreboding which nothing could remove. When I called several days later, my worst fears were realized. Canavan was missing. The front door of the shop was unlatched as usual, but Canavan was not in the house. I looked in every room. Finally, with a feeling of infinite dread, I opened the back door and looked out towards the yard. The long stalks of brown grass slid against each other in the slight breeze with dry, sibilant whispers. The dead trees reared black and motionless. Although it was late summer, I could hear neither the chirp of a bird nor the chirr of a single insect. The yard itself seemed to be listening. Feeling something against my foot, I glanced down and saw thick twine stretch from inside the door, across the scant cleared space immediately adjacent to the house, and thence into the wavering wall of grass. Instantly, I recalled Canavan's mention of a plan. His plan, I realized immediately, was to enter the yard trailing a stout cord behind him. No matter how he twisted and turned, he must have reasoned he could always find his way out by following back along the cord. It seemed like a workable scheme, and I felt relieved. Probably Canavan was still in the yard. I decided I would wait for him to come out. Perhaps if he were permitted to roam around in the yard long enough without interruption, the place would lose its evil fascination for him, and he would forget about it. I went back into the shop and browsed among the books. At the end of an hour, I became uneasy again. I wondered how long Canavan had been in the yard. When I began reflecting on the old man's uncertain health, I felt a sense of responsibility. I finally returned to the back door, saw that he was nowhere in sight, and called out his name. I experienced the disquieting sensation that my shout carried no further than the very edge of the whispering fringe of grass. It was as if the sound had been smothered, deadened, mollified, as soon as the vibrations of it reached the border of that overgrown yard. I called again and again, but there was no reply. At length I decided to go in after him. I would follow along the cord, I thought, and I would be sure to locate him. I told myself that the thick grass undoubtedly did stifle my shout, and possibly in any case Canavan might be growing slightly deaf. Just inside the door, the cord was tied securely around the leg of a heavy table. Taking hold of the twine, I crossed the cleared area back of the house and slipped into the rustling expanse of grass. The going was easy at first, and I made good progress. As I advanced, however, the grass stems became thicker and grew closer together, and I was forced to shove my way through them. When I was no more than a few yards inside the tangle, I was overwhelmed with the same bottomless sense of desolation which I had experienced before. There was certainly something uncanny about the place. I felt as if I had suddenly veered into another world. A world of briars and brindle grass, whose ceaseless half-heard whisperings were somehow alive with evil. As I pushed along, the cord abruptly came to an end. Glancing down, I saw that it had caught against a thorn bush, abraded itself, and subsequently broke. Although I bent down and poked in the area for several minutes, I was unable to locate the piece from which it had parted. Probably Canavan was unaware that the cord had broken and was now pulling it along with him. I straightened up, cupped my hands to my mouth, and shouted. My shout seemed to be all but drowned in my throat by that dismal wall of grass. I felt as if I were down at the bottom of a well, shouting up. Frowning with growing uneasiness, I tramped ahead. The grass stalks kept getting thicker and tougher, and at length I needed both hands to propel myself through the matted growth. I began to sweat profusely. My head started to ache, and I imagined that my vision was beginning to blur. I felt the same tense, almost unbearable oppression which one experiences on a stifling summer's day when a storm is brewing and the atmosphere is charged with static electricity. Also, I realized with a slight qualm of fear that I had got turned around and didn't know which part of the yard I was in. During an objective half-minute in which I reflected that I was actually worried about getting lost in someone's backyard, I almost laughed. Almost. But there was something about the place which didn't permit laughter. I plodded ahead with a sober face. Presently I began to feel that I was not alone. I had a sudden, hair-raising conviction that someone, or something, was creeping along in the grass behind me. I cannot say with certainty that I heard anything, although I may have, but all at once I was firmly convinced that some creature was crawling or wriggling a short distance in my rear. I felt that I was being watched, and that the watcher was wholly malignant. For a wild instant I considered headlong flight, then unaccountably rage took possession of me. I was suddenly furious with Canavan, furious with the yard, furious with myself. All my pent-up tension exploded in a gust of rage, which swept away fear. Now I vowed I would get to the root of this weird business. I would be tormented and frustrated by it no longer. I whirled without warning and lunged into the grass where I believed my stealthy pursuer might be hiding. I stopped abruptly. My savage anger melted into inexpressible horror. In the faint, brassy sunlight which filtered down through the towering stalks of brindle grass, Canavan crouched on all fours like a beast about to spring. His glasses were gone, his clothes were in shreds, and his mouth was twisted into an insane grimace, half smirk, half snarl. I stood petrified, staring at him. His eyes, clearly out of focus, glared at me with concentrated hatred and without any faint glimmer of recognition. His gray hair was matted with grass and small sticks. His entire body, in fact, including the tattered remains of his clothing, was covered with them as if he had groveled or rolled on the ground like a wild animal. After the first throat-freezing shock, I finally found my tongue. "Canavan!" I screamed at him. "Canavan, for God's sake, don't you know me?" His answer was a low, throaty snarl. His lips twisted back from his yellowish teeth and his crouching body tensed for a spring. Pure terror took possession of me. I leaped aside and flung myself into that infernal wall of grass an instant before he lunged. The intensity of my terror must have given me added strength. I rammed headlong through those twisted stalks, which before I had laboriously pulled aside. I could hear the grass and briar bushes crashing behind me, and I knew that I was running for my life. I pounded on as in a nightmare. Grass stalks snapped against my face like whips, and thorns gashed me like razors, but I felt nothing. All my physical and mental resources were concentrated in one frenzied resolve. I must get out of that devil's field of grass, and away from the monstrous thing which followed swiftly in my wake. My breath began coming in great shuddering sobs. My legs felt weak, and I seemed to be looking through spinning saucers of light. But I ran on. The thing behind me was gaining. I could hear it growling, and I could feel it lunge against the earth only inches back of my flying feet. And all the time I had the maddening conviction that I was actually running in circles. At last, when I felt that I must surely collapse in another second, I plunged through a final brindle thicket into the open sunlight. Ahead of me lay the cleared area at the rear of Canavan's shop. Just beyond was the house itself. Gasping and fighting for breath, I dragged myself toward the door. For no reason that I could explain then or afterwards, I felt absolutely certain that the horror at my heels would not venture into the open area. I didn't even turn around to make sure. Inside the house, I fell weakly into a chair. My strained breathing slowly returned to normal, but my mind remained caught up in a whirlwind of sheer horror and hideous conjecture. Canavan, I realized, had gone completely mad. Some ghastly shock had turned him into a ravening bestial lunatic, thirsting for the savage destruction of any living thing that crossed his path. Remembering the oddly focused eyes which had glared at me with a glaze of animal ferocity, I knew that his mind had not been merely unhinged. It had been totally destroyed. Death could be the only possible release. But Canavan was still at least the shell of a human being, and he had been my friend. I could not take the law into my own hands. With many misgivings, I called the police and an ambulance. What followed was more madness, plus an inquisitorial section of questions and demands, which left me in a state of near nervous collapse. A half-dozen burly policemen spent the better part of an hour tramping through that wavering brindle grass without locating any trace of Canavan. They came out cursing, rubbing their eyes, and shaking their head. They were flushed, furious, and ill at ease. They announced that they had seen nothing and heard nothing except some sneaking dog, which stayed always out of sight and growled at them at intervals. When they mentioned the growling dog, I opened my mouth to speak, but thought better of it and said nothing. They were already regarding me with open suspicion, as if they believed my own mind might be breaking. I repeated my story at least 20 times, and still they were all not satisfied. They ransacked the entire house. They inspected Canavan's files. They even removed some loose boards in one of the rooms and searched underneath. At length they grudgingly concluded that Canavan had suffered total loss of memory after experiencing some kind of shock, and that he had wandered off the premises in a state of amnesia shortly after I had encountered him in the yard. My own description of his appearance and actions they discounted as lurid exaggeration. After warning me that I would probably be questioned further, and that my own premises might be inspected, they reluctantly permitted me to leave. Their subsequent researches and investigations revealed nothing new, and Canavan was put down as a missing person, probably afflicted with acute amnesia. But I was not satisfied, and I could not rest. 6 months of patient, painstaking, tedious research in the files and stacks of the local university library finally yielded something which I do not offer as an explanation, nor even as a definite clue, but only as a fantastic near impossibility which I ask no one to believe. One afternoon, after my extended research over a period of months had produced nothing of significance, the keeper of rare books at the university library triumphantly bore to my study niche a tiny, crumbling pamphlet which had been printed in New Haven in 1695. It mentioned no author and carried the stark title, Death of Goody Larkin's Witch. Several years before, it revealed an ancient crone, one Goody Larkins, had been accused by neighbors of turning a missing child into a wild dog. The Salem madness was raging at the time, and Goody Larkins had been summarily condemned to death. Instead of being burned, she had been driven into a marsh deep in the woods, where 7 savage dogs, starved for a fortnight, had been turned loose on her trail. Apparently, her accusers felt that this was a touch of truly poetic justice. As the ravening dogs closed in on her, she was heard by her retreating neighbors to utter a frightful curse. "Let this land I fall upon lie all the way to hell," she had screamed, "and they who tarry here be as these beasts that rend me dead." A subsequent inspection of old maps and land deeds satisfied me that the marsh in which Goody Larkin was torn to pieces by the dogs after uttering her awful curse originally occupied the same lot or square which now enclosed Canavan's hellish backyard. I say no more. I returned only once to that devilish spot. It was a cold, desolate autumn day, and a keening wind rattled the brindle stalks in that unholy acre. I cannot say what urged me back. Perhaps it was some lingering feeling of loyalty towards the Canavan I had known. Perhaps it was even some last shred of hope. But as soon as I entered the cleared area behind Canavan's boarded-up house, I knew I had made a mistake. As I stared at the stiff waving grass, the bare trees, and the black ragged briar bushes, I felt as if I in turn were being watched. I felt as if something alien and wholly evil was observing me, and though I was terrified, I experienced a perverse, insane impulse to rush headlong into that whispering expanse. Again I imagined I saw that monstrous landscape subtly alter its dimensions and perspectives, until I was staring towards a stretch of blowing brindle grass and rotted trees which ran for miles. Something urged me to enter, to lose myself in the lovely grass, to roll and grovel at its roots, to rip off the foolish encumbrances of cloth which covered me, and run howling and ravenous on and on and on. Instead, I turned and rushed away. I ran through the windy autumn streets like a madman. I lurched into my rooms and bolted the door. I have never gone back since, and I never shall.